Well, welcome to today's video, and today's video is a bit of an odd one because we're going to be looking at ESP-NOW and specifically the changes that have come about through the library being upgraded to version 3.0.0. So let's have a look and see what I mean. Now, we are all used to seeing updates to our libraries and even to our board managers. So let's just double click on the Arduino IDE. It starts up. It obviously goes back to the last project that you're working on, and you'll see down in the right hand corner there are some updates that are available for some of your libraries, and there are updates that are available for some of your boards. So I'm just going to click on the install manually, and we see up on the left hand side that the change is on the ESP32 library. Now, the version that I'd got installed was 2.0.17. That is, if you like, the latest of the version 2 boards. Now they have brought out version 3. Now you would just think, okay, that's brilliant. They've added some new boards. They've fixed a few bugs in the system. Brilliant. Let's get it installed. Oh, if only life was that simple. So let's have a look at the problems that have occurred. Now, one thing before we look at the problems, just so that you understand what has gone on here, the guys who, if you like, write the library, they have not themselves caused this issue. What has happened is Expresses themselves, the underlying, if you like, operating system for the ESP32 has been upgraded. I think it's now in version 5. I think it's 5.12 or 5.14 is the latest version. So the version 3 library has had to take into account the changes that Expressive have made. So this isn't about the guys who write the library making changes. They've had to make changes because changes have been made, if you like, to the foundations that the library sits on. Now, you might think, well, why would Expressive do this? Well, one of the issues is we are just makers. We're doing this basically as a hobby. As such, the number of ESP32 boards that are made for makers is very small. If you were making an embedded system, they will be basically churning out ESP32 modules into your remote lighting system or something, and they'll be doing tens of thousands at a time. So that makes, if you like, our department very, very small and probably not Expressive's priority customer, shall we say. Anyway, let's have a look at the problems that have occurred. Now, for today's tutorial, I am going to be using my NowRail test system, specifically these two ESP32 dev modules, and there is an ESP32 dev module in the back of this controller that I'm working on. Don't worry about the labels, those are to do with the NowRail project, but it was through the NowRail project that I discovered these particular bugs, because NowRail relies on ESP-NOW. So going back to the desktop, I'm still using the 2.0.17 library. And all I have done is I've taken the two examples. You just go down to ESP32, I've taken ESP-NOW, and I've got the basic master and the basic slave sketches running. As you see on the desktop, basic master on the left, basic slave on the right, and there is some communication going on between the two boards. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to update my library and we will see what happens. So after a bit of a wait, the version 3 library is now installed, and I'm going to show you where I first came across the error, and it's actually on the slave sketch. So I'm just going to compile this now under the new board manager library. So I've tried to compile the sketch, and as you see, I now get an error message, and it is all to do with this, if you like, function here, the ESP-NOW register receive CB function. So let's have a look a little bit more at that error. So when you start to look at this error, it's all about an invalid conversion. Now, I must admit, when I first got this, I was absolutely baffled, because in my mind there was, hang on, this code has been working for months. Why would it suddenly break overnight? So let's have a look and see just what has changed in the way that we now need to set up the function for the OnDataRecv, because that is the first area that needs to be changed. So the sketch I'm going to be using is this one here, ESP-NOW ESP3.0 version 2. Now, to download the code, if I just go back to the intro screen, you can see bottom left there is that link to the Digital Town website. The code will be available on there. So going back to the sketch, the first thing that I'm going to do is deal with this OnDataRecv. Now, what I've done is I've put the old version in so you can see how it works. So the old version, we used to get an array with the MAC address. We used to get the data in an array and obviously an integer that gave us the length of that data, because you just don't know how much data is being sent over. The new version is different. You've still got that integer for the length. You've still got the array for the data, but here it changed completely. And it's almost like you've now got a function within a function. And rather than before, where you could only get the MAC address of the sending unit, as you will see with the new version, you can not just get the sending address, but you can also get the address that it was sending to. So for my projects, a lot of my projects use broadcast mode, so it's just sort of the standard FF type address rather than the specific MAC address of a board. Now, with this function, I have written this function in the way that I would normally write it. When you are using ESP-NOW, you really need to think of the OnDataRecv as an interrupt. So the amount of code in it needs to be as small as possible. And what you tend to do is move the data out of the incoming, if you like, data format, stick it into somewhere safe, set a flag to say that some data has been arrived, and then going down to the main loop, I am just processing the data that has been received in the main loop. But it's important to get this data out of this function as quickly as possible. If you put any long sections of code within this function, quite often you will see that your board will crash and restart. Now, just taking a look at what I've actually done here, usually when people are using ESP-NOW, they will create a data structure and move the data into that structure. Now, with this new section here, this actually creates a data structure. Part of that data structure is the source address, there is the destination address. I've put a link in the top of the sketch to the documentation for this, and if I take you to that documentation, you can see that there is a source address that replaces the original MAC address. There's a destination address. There is also some other items to do with the packet. I didn't need to use that, so I'll be honest, I have not gone into that in this tutorial. So going back to that function, as you can see, I've now moved the source address, it's 6 bytes of data, and I've put that into an array. I've got the destination address that I've put into a second array, and then in my project, instead of creating a structure for all the data that's sent, NowRail just happens to send 50 bytes of data in a format that I already have. So I just literally have moved the incoming data into my received data array, and I just process it straight out of there. It's one of those things you don't need to necessarily use a structure for this section of the data, although in a lot of projects that's very helpful. Again, packet length, just so that you know how much data has been sent across, because certainly if there's a string or something, you just won't know how long the data packet is that has been sent over. And once again, this flag just goes down into my main loop, and I've got a sort of an, if that flag has been made greater than 0, then process the incoming data. All I'm doing is serial printing it out. If you started to do this sort of serial print within that data receive function, you stand a good chance of crashing the function, especially if you've got a lot of data where all of a sudden it's receiving one packet after another, and it receives a packet before it has dealt with the previous packet. So to run this sketch, what I've done here, I've just turned on the NowRail controller. The reason I've turned this on is it sends 50 bytes of data once a second. As that clock's updating, it transmits that information out, and I'm now going to be picking it up off this ESP32 here. The reason that I've done that is that if you run two of these sketches together, which is what I've written the sketch for, so it receives and transmits, but this just made it easier just to check the incoming data. And as you can see now, I've got this information coming in. I'm getting the transmitting MAC address, so that is the MAC address of that hand controller. As you can see, my destination address is the broadcast address. That is, if you like, the calling all stations. The length of the data sent over was 50 bytes, and then I have just serial printed out the 50 bytes. For this particular part of the NowRail system, it is only using probably, what's that, the first 25 bytes of the transmission. So that sort of deals with the OnDataRecv. I've now, if you like, got this function working, but as I continued with my investigations, I started to find quite a few other little subtle changes that you will need to make in your code, and that's why this particular sketch is a transmit and a receive. So the way this is working, once again, I am transmitting to the broadcast address. Obviously, if you want to transmit to a specific ESP32, you're going to need to put its MAC address in. I'm sending a packet length of 50, so I've got a send array and a receive array that both take 50 bytes. And then I'm just using my standard current millis and a timer so that it is doing the transmission once a second, because for those who know my tutorials, you know that I hate delay. So let's get down to the setup. Now in the setup, I did find that I needed to make some changes, and one of the first changes I had to make was adding this little bit of code here. I discovered this almost by accident, because obviously I serial print out the MAC address, and all of a sudden there was no MAC address. It was just a set of zeros, and it was almost like the system hadn't started. Whereas with the old sketches, it was almost like the system just started immediately. You sort of put your mode in and it just ran. It just didn't seem to work that way now. So I've added this little bit of code in, and that then gives the MAC address to the unit. Then I have done the ESP-NOW initiation. This is, if you like, start ESP-NOW up. That then gets that working. I've then got the OnDataRecv function being set up, and then I've added a peer just to add a board that was being broadcast to. In my case, of course, the broadcast address happens to be the general broadcast address rather than a specific board, but I've added this code in just so that you can see that it's sort of working in the normal way. Once all that was done, going down to the main loop, again, I've just got a timer that's running sort of once a second, and all it does in this timer is it fills the array with a set of values, which is a value W, it's just a counter 0 to 50, and it adds that to a value Q that gets incremented each time the loop runs. The idea being that, if you like, the values that I'm seeing transmitted change so that I can see the values arriving are changing. Apart from that, it's just the old, ESP-NOW send. The result, obviously, you can get an error if it doesn't transmit. There is that, you can sort of serial print out the error message. If you go to this particular link that I've left inside the code, it gives you all the error codes. So whatever your error message is, if you then go to this particular web page, you can discover what mistake you've made, or just what has gone wrong. So what I've now done is I have uploaded the same sketch to these two boards, so they are both going to be receiving and transmitting at the same time. So from a transmission and receiving point of view, let's just stop these scrolling. From a transmission point of view, I was just serial printing the value of Q. That is the 191 that you can see here, and 105 on the other side. That was basically so that I could make sure that the information being received was correct. Obviously, the output that you're seeing here is in hexadecimal, but it all works out. The 0 that you're seeing is the result from the ESP send. It comes out as 0 because the transmission has been successful. Obviously, if this number changes, then you can look up in the error code, and there's probably something built in that will let you just print out the error anyway. From my point of view, I didn't need that for my project. And then obviously I can see that my 50 bytes of data have been received at both ends. Now, I hope this video has been sort of useful to you, especially if you're using ESP-NOW, but it just goes to show when you get a major change that there can be all sorts of consequences that you might not realize. And it's one of the reasons why when I start my IDE up, when it sort of talks about, do you want to install these boards or do you want to update this library, I tend not to do it until I've sort of read through all the documentation. I discovered this error because someone had tried to upload NowRail and it wouldn't compile, and then we discovered that they had got version 3 installed. So I've now had to change NowRail to deal with version 3. One little thing that I'd just like to show you from the NowRail project. This is part of the NowRail system. Now, usually when you're doing a project, if you're just building some code for yourself, you're going to be using one version of the board manager or another. For something like NowRail, where it's going to be compiled on different people's computers, I don't know which version of the board manager they are using. So you can use these guards. So I've got the sort of the normal guard defining the ESP32 code, but then I've also got this separate guard that is, if you like, if I am using the ESP IDF version greater than 5, then I need to add this particular piece of code in. And I think there's some more going further down. So I've just found these two where I've got one version of the OnDataRecv function for IDF 4 and below, and the other version right below it for version greater than 4. So if you've got some code that's unfortunately going to be compiled on other people's computers, you may have to start adding this sort of code in just to make sure that it works on the different versions. So I hope that's been useful to you, and if you've got those errors occurring with your ESP-NOW code, then you can start to see how to get around them. I've a feeling that there will be various other areas of the ESP32 library that has changed, and as I find these different issues, I'll try and do some videos to deal with those. If you've got any other issues, or if you notice something else, please put some information in the comments below the video so that others can be helped with this. So that's about it for today, and I hope it's been useful. So bye for now.